Grand Tours are the pinnacle of road racing. 3 weeks of pain, suffering, tactics, teamwork, glory and failure. And that's just here in the GCN studio. The Giro d'Italia, the Tour de France and the Vuelta a España provide a giant moving symphony of noise and colour as the identity of the eventual winner slowly but surely reveals themselves across the roads of Europe. But what makes a Grand Tour great? What are the ingredients needed in order to ensure that the race serves up an exciting fight for the overall win? Because not all Grand Tours are great. Some are absolutely sensational from start to finish, but others feel flat and unsatisfying and never really spark and crackle into life. So let's dig into the details of what makes the perfect Grand Tour. The route is the first thing we find out about on any given Grand Tour. Some details are revealed a year or more in advance. For instance, we've known the Tour de France this summer would be starting in Denmark since August 2020, but we usually get the most of the details about 9 months before the race begins. And when the route does get revealed, I know what I look for first. Are the well-known summit finishes on there? The set pieces, the glamorous climbs. I want to see Alpe d'Huez, Mont Ventoux, the Tourmalet, the Galibier, Sestriere, Zoncolan, the Angliru, Lagos de Covadonga. But even though we love to see all the big climbs on the routes as often as possible, we can't have too much of a good thing. After we all get used to which climbs are and are not on any given route, actually, the most important aspect of any Grand Tour route is balance. There has to be a balance between mountains and time trials. If there are too many climbs and summit finishes, we might end up with something like the 2011 Giro, where the best climber in the race, Alberto Contador, just took time out of everyone day after day and the result became a formality. If there are too many time trials, the opposite happens and it gives no chance to the climbers. This is the scenario we had during the Miguel Indurain years of the Tour, when there would regularly be more than 150 kilometers of time trials, giving the climby types like Claudio Chiappucci and Marco Pantani zero chance against Big Mig. So there has to be a balance. The route has to be tempting for both types of riders. Both have to be able to convince themselves that there are stages where they can take time out of the other guys. If there are enough separate stages where a wide spread of riders think exactly that, then you get exciting racing. But it's not just the stages in and of themselves, they need to be presented in the right order. You can't have all the time trials stacked in the first week, and similarly, you can't smash all of the summit finishes into the final week. The stages need to provide the GC battle with the ability to ebb and flow and get turned on its head from one day to the next. As an example, I think this is where the 2022 Giro route got it wrong. The last week was packed with mountains, too packed. So much so that all of the GC riders were happy to just let the race play out without them for most of the middle 10 stages. There was also no time trial in the middle of the race to shake up the GC. It didn't need to be a long test, just something, enough to swap a few places and get a few riders worried enough that they needed to attack on a climb the next day. So again, it's balance. A balance of stage types, but also balanced evenly along the route so that the temptation for the riders to declare an unofficial stalemate, such as we had in this year's Giro, is not an option. Of course, it's easy for me to suggest this now after we know what happened in that Giro, but the route itself is only part of the magic formula. The other main ingredient is the riders. What we saw in this year's Giro was two riders, Jai Hindley and Richard Carapaz, who were so evenly matched that right up until stage 20, there was never more than 10 seconds between them on GC. 3 kilometers at the end of the Marmolada climb was what made the difference in Hindley winning the Giro and Carapaz losing it. Up until that moment, it seemed like they both fancied themselves to beat the other in the final time trial, and they were happy enough with the status quo. But if the identity of the riders on that same route were different, we'd have had a different race. Usually, the best Grand Tours are when two totally different riders go head to head. The 2012 Giro was a cracker. That was a time trialist rider, Hejidal, going up against a diminutive climber, Joaquim Rodriguez. The 2011 Tour de France was, in my opinion, the last great Tour de France we had, which was the same. Bigger, more time trially Cadel Evans against the chronophobic, skinny climber Andy Schleck. If we had had Hejidal versus Rodriguez or Evans versus Schleck on the route of the 2022 Giro, it would have been a completely different and perhaps far more exciting race than what we were served up. So obviously there's a combination of route and riders. But what the race organisers can just never know when they unveil their route is which riders are going to end up riding their race. Okay, for the Tour de France, it's probably a bit different. By and large, all of the world's best riders want to be there. For the Giro and Vuelta, it's always much more uncertain. For the Giro, it's often a case of trying to attract the biggest stars they can who don't want to focus on the Tour. This year, that came in the form of Richard Carapaz, Simon Yates and Romain Bardet. For the Vuelta, it can be much more of a lottery. It's usually the testing ground for up-and-coming Grand Tour talent, as it was for Tadej Pogacar in 2019 when he won 3 stages and finished on the podium of his debut Grand Tour, and as it will be this year for Remco Evenepoel, aiming to prove that his debut Grand Tour at the Giro last year was just a false start. But the Vuelta can also often be peppered with stage racing royalty who are carrying form over from the Tour de France, like Roglic tends to do, or any riders who had a bad Tour de France or a bad year in general and are seeking redemption. So for the race organisers, hosting a perfect Grand Tour is actually an impossible task. They're only in control of so much and they can never know if the route they create, coupled with the riders who show up, will provide the suspense required to give an exciting 3 weeks. Sometimes they, and we, just get lucky. But they are in charge of the route, by and large. There will always be restrictions on where logistically they can bring the race and where feasibly they can close the roads for long enough to conduct a time trial, for instance. So the only golden rule, in my view, is balance. And the Giro didn't really have it. But does the Tour de France? Well, in this case, I think the identity of the riders is more important than any aspect of the route design. Well, the identity of one rider in particular, Tadej Pogacar. He is so clearly stronger than all of his rivals that the idea of balance or suspense doesn't really seem to apply. It's an interesting one though, because when Pog took 3 minutes out of everyone as early as stage 8 last year, I was crestfallen. The battle for the Tour was over before it even began. But then we had the opposite at the Giro, where we had no idea who was going to win until the final weekend, but in both cases what was missing was the feeling of suspense with regular payoffs. So how are we going to get it in the 2022 Tour de France? As I've already said, the organisers can only do so much. They have a time trial at the start and at the end, just like the Giro, although the final time trial is 40 kilometres at the Tour, where it was only 17 kilometres at the Giro. There seems to be much more balance to the positioning of the mountain stages, 2 in each week. But does it matter given that Pog is there? There's nothing the ASO can do about Pog. He's a phenomenon. The only way that we're going to get that sense of suspense and to have a jeopardy surrounding the identity of the winner of the race is if Pog inexplicably loses time in an unexpected place. A crash, crosswinds, a split in the bunch. And remember, this happened to Pog before in 2020. He lost 1 minute 21 on stage 7. Now he ended up winning the Tour anyway, but it was that time loss that provided the jeopardy and the suspense with an incredible payoff at the end. And what makes me interested in this year's race is that despite the fact that Pog is the overwhelming favourite, the other teams must be thinking the exact same thing. The only way they can beat him is if they make him lose time in unexpected ways. Again, it will be an exercise in hindsight whether this year's Tour will have been a great Grand Tour, just a good one, or even a bad one. And we can then know if the ingredients which went into it were ever going to have provided us with an exciting race or not. Bit of a tongue twister of tenses there, but I think what I'm trying to say is that every Grand Tour has the potential to be a great one because we just never know what is going to happen, and that itself is something to get excited about. But what do you all think? Does this year's Tour de France route provide enough scope for rivals to ambush Tadej Pogacar? Do you think the Giro got their route wrong? Or does it even matter? Is every Grand Tour perfect because it's 3 straight weeks of racing regardless? What are the ingredients that would make your perfect Grand Tour? Let us know